Hi, Misha here. The Japanese A6M, the Mitsubishi, is extremely famous as the Zero or the Zeke, but maybe a little less famous is Mitsubishi's earlier design, the A5M, known officially as the Type 96 Model 1 carrier fighter by the Navy. And actually, this was the world's first metal, low monowing aircraft to be operated from a carrier, and was quite advanced for its day and time, and in a lot of ways has a lot in common with the later A6M, which is not surprising because not only did it come from Mitsubishi, it actually had the same lead designer for the team there. And I have two models here, both 1/72 scale, and for once not die-cast. These are plastic from Easy Models, just because I couldn't find a die-cast example. In fact, the only one I know exists for sure is from De Agostini, released in Japan, and they haven't been imported here yet, so we'll make do with these. There's really not much difference except the paint scheme. One is officially an A5M1, the other is an A5M2, and the differences are pretty much negligible for the point of this video. But I brought them both out because why not? The origins of this here fighter go back to 1934. The Navy had been using the Nakajima A2N and A4N for naval fighters, and the Navy wanted a new modern advanced carrier fighter, although they didn't actually put the carrier part in the specifications officially, but it was just kind of understood. And both Nakajima and Mitsubishi would get to work making designs. The Mitsubishi would be known internally as the KA-14, and the first prototype would fly on February 4, 1935. Now, the specifications were ambitious but pretty simple. The aircraft needed to achieve 220 miles per hour or greater and have a good climb performance for the day. It needed to reach an altitude of 16,000 feet in about 6.5 minutes. Well, the initial prototype that Mitsubishi came up with definitely hit that. In fact, it originally got up to 284 miles per hour. But the original prototype had a gull wing, an inverted gull wing, kind of like you would see on an F4U Corsair. This gave some stability problems, much like how the F4U had some problems. So instead of trying to resolve them, the second prototype was fitted with more of a traditional wing, and it would soon fly. They would end up making a total of 6 prototypes, trying out different engines and arrangements. But it wasn't long before the Mitsubishi was selected and then officially adopted in 1936 as the Type 96 Model 1 carrier fighter and ordered into full-scale mass production. Now, it is worth pointing out that the Japanese Army, who had been using biplanes before, also took an interest, and Mitsubishi would make a version for them that would be known as the KI-18, and it would be tried against an evolution of Nakajima's prototype for this, and this time the Army would end up selecting the Nakajima, which would go into production as the KI-27. The reason that the Army did not go for the A5M, they didn't feel it was maneuverable enough for their needs. The Army always had maneuverability more in mind, whereas the Navy was more concerned with range, endurance, and speed, and of course operating from a carrier. So yeah, it didn't have success with the Army, but the Navy liked it. It was adopted in 36, and the first deliveries would start to occur in early 1937, so this was in service in time when the Second Sino-Japanese War would kick off that summer. So what do we have here as a plane? Well, we're about 25 feet long with a 36-foot wingspan. The production models were able to reach a speed of about 270 miles per hour, a max altitude of 32,000 feet. They had a fixed undercarriage, as you see on these models. Retracting carriages were a thing when Mitsubishi was designing this, and they did consider them, but at the time the gear to do it would have added more weight, and they felt that the added weight wasn't worth it, that the performance increase of having a retracted gear would be so small that the added weight and complication would not make up for it. So they went with a fixed landing gear, old school style. As you see, it has an open cockpit with a windscreen but no full canopy. Pretty common for the 1935 to 36 period. It was a little on the lightly armed side, although again for that day not so much so. It had two 7.7 millimeter 30 caliber machine guns mounted in the fuselage, firing through the propeller. And it could carry a couple of small bombs, about 65-pound bombs, one under each wing, or it could carry an external fuel tank under the belly. Of course, it had a crew of one, three-bladed propeller, and its overall design has led many to say it resembles the P-26 pea shooter, the Boeing, and it's kind of funny if you look at the U.S. Army at the time, and even some in the U.S. media, they actually felt it was a copy of the Boeing, which it is not. It has its own genesis and own design. It is not a copy, but there's only so many ways to make a aircraft, and with the technology of the era, more than a few ended up resembling each other. It also looks a little bit like the P-36 as well. So, what about this plane's service history? One of the first fleet carriers to begin operating the new A5M was Kaga in 1937, and these were quickly deployed to China that summer. And the first large engagement it was used in came on September 19, when 18 of these engaged a larger Chinese force, mixed force of various things, older biplanes and a few new monoplanes. And don't know exactly how many Chinese planes are there, but around 30 at most, at least. And the A5M came out ahead. One of its earliest real competitors was the P-26 pea shooter, as I mentioned a second ago. It was flown by Chinese, and the A5M outclassed it, but they were pretty evenly matched, and for historical purposes, this was the first time that two monowing all-metal planes would really meet for dogfights. And then later, it would start engaging Russian I-15s and their newer I-16, which gave it a run for its money, and they were more evenly matched, especially later versions of the I-16. But again, the A5M seemed to still have the edge. Then, in 1938, early in around February, the light carrier Ryuho, I guess it's a light carrier, it's kind of a medium carrier because it could carry nearly 50 planes. But anyway, Ryuho got its first A5Ms, and then when she was out of refit, Akagi got them as well. and so on and so forth. For example, the old carrier Hosho would get some, and when they were commissioned, Joiho and Shoho would have them as well. And this would all take place between 1938 and 1940 in that time frame. The original A5M1 would give way to an improved or uprated engine version called the A5M2. No other real changes. A5M3, as best I can understand, was just a prototype trying an alternative engine, but it doesn't seem to have been produced in any real numbers. And then the final version, which was in service by 1940, was the A5M4. And it, again, had an improved engine. It also was capable of mounting a centerline drop tank for fuel, so once it was exhausted, the pilot could just release it, as opposed to older tanks that were fixed. And it had an enclosed cockpit and enclosed a full canopy. Interestingly, most Navy pilots actually preferred the open canopy, at least back then, because they felt it gave them better visibility. And I think just a little bit on the tradition front as well. So yeah, these saw quite a bit of use in China, and they were pretty much on board every Japanese carrier. They also were stationed at most naval bases in Japan and ports and bases scattered throughout the Pacific where the Japanese had a presence, and of course they were stationed on land detached from the Navy in China. It proved itself to be a good dogfighter. Despite the Army's criticism, the Navy felt it was quite maneuverable. It was very fast for its day and time. It was also durable. It could take a few hits and keep on going. It had good range and endurance for the time, which is something a Navy fighter really does need. It was a good handler for landing on the carriers of the day. So its only real detractions were its just mid-1930s design, which was already becoming a little dated by the beginning of the 1940s, and the fact that it only had 2 machine guns for armament. Interestingly, the U.S. seemed to perceive it as having 4 machine guns, which it didn't. There's a interesting U.S. military, primarily Navy, training video on YouTube that talks about this, and you can tell they really didn't have a good grasp on Japanese planes. For example, they said that the Ki-27 was an Army use version of this, in which it wasn't. That was a Nakajima design. They also claimed it was a ripoff of a P-26, which it is not, as I said. And most amusingly, they actually perceived the A6M Zero as simply an improvement of this with retracting landing gear, enclosed canopy, and so on. To that end, in 1941, when World War II began, the U.S. military still thought the A5M was Japan's frontline Navy fighter, again, not really understanding that the A6M was an improvement, but it was. The A6M, the specification for it began in 1937. By 1939, Mitsubishi had designed it, and its first combat kind of testing was in 1940, and it was immediately put into production and use because while the A5M here was a good plane, the A6M was better. Now, to be fair, the A5M, you could argue, might have been a better dogfighter in absolute terms, but the A6M had a better punch, 4 guns instead of 2. But where it really excelled was its incredible range. And also, of course, it was faster. Anyhow, the U.S., the Allies, would give this the interesting reporting name of Claude, which, yeah, okay. So when World War II began, these were already being phased out in frontline units and replaced with the newer A6M. But they still had a part to play in World War II. None of the carriers at the Pearl Harbor attack had any Claudes on board, A5Ms. They'd all been replaced by the newer A6M. Kaga, Akagi, Rihu, who had some briefly, had replaced theirs, and newer carriers like Shokaku never even had them. But on February 1st, when the USS Enterprise launched some SBDs against targets in the Gilbert Islands, some of the Japanese naval bases there still had some A5Ms, and they were launched, and they did shoot down at least 3 of the Dauntlesses. In April of 1942, when Ryuho put into port, she would swap her A5Ms. She'd been using the latest A5M4s for the new A6M2. But Shoho would still have 4 or so on board when she was used. It would become the Battle of the Coral Sea, May 7 of 1942. And they would again see some combat. Now, Shoho was sunk, being the first Japanese carrier to be sunk with a war. But before that, when the U.S. planes came in to attack her, 2 of her A5Ms were flying CAP, Combat Air Patrol, along with 1 A6M. When the U.S. planes were spotted, 3 more of her A6Ms were put into the air, for a total of 6 planes. And while they tried to defend the carrier, and even a couple of planes were credited by being shot down by the A5Ms, it was, not to be. She was sunk, and because the planes had nowhere to go, only one of them would make it to a nearby island and land. The other ones had to ditch in the ocean. And that was the last combat use of the A5M. However, it was still deployed one more time. That would be for the Battle of Midway. The light carrier Zoiho, would have a handful still on board, along with some of the newer A6Ms. They wouldn't really see combat except maybe, again, in the CAP. And it is worth pointing out that after the disaster that was Midway for the Japanese, during the retreat, Zuiho's CAP did drive off the Americans that tried to go at them, so they might have fired a few rounds if indeed any of the A5Ms were even on that CAP, but no major engagements or uses. So that was pretty much it. There might have been 1 or 2 Japanese bases that still had a Claude or so kicking around, but by this point enough A6Ms were available. And then soon, by 1943, Japan would find itself in the position of actually having more fighters than skilled pilots to fly them. So the A5M was pretty much out of service, with one exception. There was a variant known as the A5M4K, which was a conversion to 2 seats, used as a trainer. They would have roughly 104 of these, and so they would continue using a perfectly good training plane back at home, freeing up that many A6Ms for actual military use. So they would keep doing this 1943 even into 44 until spare parts became an issue. But of course, you know what's coming next. If whatever was still flyable in 1945 usually had some kind of bomb strapped to it and was turned into a kamikaze, and the surviving few A5M 4s were no exception. Both the single-seat survivors and the two-seat K models were turned into kamikazes that year, especially that summer. And so they kind of saw a substitute standard use at the end of the war as a last-ditch defense. To that end, of the roughly 1,094 built between 1936 and 1939, no complete examples are known in the world today. There are a few incomplete examples, there are some parts, and of course there are some wrecked ones at the bottom of the sea for sure. But yeah, there are no complete Claudes in museums, just bits and pieces. Which is a shame, because it was actually a good plane, if not outstanding. It was just a victim of that time period where technology was progressing so quickly. And honestly, if the war had gone differently for Japan, the A6M would have given away to the A7M as early as 1943, because in turn, as the A5M was replaced in a couple of years by the A6M, the A6M, while the best thing going in 1940, was already obsolescent by 1943, and Japan knew this. They had a replacement on the boards, but they didn't have the resources to put it into production and take the old one out. But that's a story for another video. But yeah, I've been meaning to do this one for quite a long time. These easy models are not bad. They're good little substitutes if you can't find the die-cast. They are pre-painted. They usually have all the full antenna. They even have spinning propellers, and on some other moving parts depending on what it might be. No crew figures. But they're inexpensive, depending on what model it is, anywhere from $8 to $20, obviously, the more expensive being the larger ones. But yeah, they look good on a shelf, and they're the same scale, and they fit in with things like the Oxfords just fine. They're just, by their nature of being plastic, lighter. Come on. Kind of stuck to my thing a little bit. But they do have the external fuel tank here. The wheels. Again, the antenna. I am perfectly happy with it for the money. But if someone like Akins, sorry, it's been a long day. If someone like Akins gets in the De Agostini A5M, I will pick it up. I looked on eBay, but I'm not going to pay $40-50 to get one imported from someplace like Japan. It's not something I want that badly. Again, this one is a perfectly good example of a relatively minor plane. But it's worth having, and it fits right in. I do like my Japanese planes and ships. So I thought I would share. If you have any questions or comments, please post them. And as always, if you could, like, share, and if you haven't, subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.